Hi, welcome to our another webinar. I'm Lokesh Aggarwal. I'm the president and the CEO of Apexa IQ. And today I have three great friends of mine to talk about, the root cause of today's, cybersecurity problems that we are having, or any kind of problem we're having is the technical debt, right? How can we use better strategies and better things and handle the technical debt problem that we have. So I'm gonna start have Tomás, Steve, and Leon introduce yourself, and then we can get into it.
Hey everybody, I'm Tomás Maldonado. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for the National Football League. It's nice to be here with this esteemed panel, and I'm looking forward to this conversation today.
Thanks, Tomás. Steven?
Hey everyone, I'm Steven Garcia. I've been in the information security field for quite some time. My last gig was running cybersecurity over at FanDuel, so I work with Tomás closely. Very much looking forward to this panel and seeing what we can share with everybody and what we can learn ourselves.
Leon?
Yeah, Leon Ravenna. I've been in technology about 35 years now, so I've seen a lot. I am the CISO and CIO for a company called OPENLANE, and we are in the automotive remarketing space.
So great, and thank you very much for you guys are joining. And I'm gonna start. You guys can take it, Tomás or Steven. You guys want to start with the, where do you think the technical debt problem come from? Because it has become one of the biggest problem today. And the pundits are saying, and the studies are showing that this is become around $3.7 trillion market by 2030. So in the next 4 or 7 years, this problem is going to become around 3.7 trillion. And the root cause that they are saying about this is aging hardware, technical debt, and that. So I just wanted to know what your thought is, and then we can start the conversation from there. So whoever wants to take the lead.
Sure, I'll go first if Steven, you don't mind. I think the interesting part about technical debt, right? It almost spurs from a mindset of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? If you don't have to take down a machine, if you don't have to change the machine, and it's operating the way you expect it to operate, then why turn it off? Why reset it? Why update firmware? That mindset comes from years ago, right? If you think about manufacturing and sort of other types of industrial type systems where, yeah, you don't want to turn them off, and you don't actually have to turn them off. But fast forward to where we are today, where technology changes literally every minute, every second, you have to sort of pivot. You have to think about the new era, if you will, of how to manage and keep systems up to date, because you have things like new features, new functionality, and the likes that you want to take advantage of from a business standpoint. You have obviously security concerns and vulnerabilities and bugs, because last time I checked, there's still humans that are actually sitting at a keyboard coding the applications that we're leveraging, right? The Windows and other types of applications that we're leveraging. So they're still prone to error, if you will. And if you don't necessarily focus in on sort of that management life cycle of using the opportunity for enhancements that have new features, new functionality, new innovation, you end up with a pool of a lot of old assets that you have not essentially turned off, you have not looked at, you have not touched in years. Now, not all technical debt is bad debt, right? I find it interesting, the concept of debt, right? If you think about debt in just regular financial terms, right? There's good debt and there's bad debt. Not all technical debt is bad, but the ones left untreated or unlooked after for years at a time and are essentially prone to more risk by way of where they're interfacing with, right? So think of externally facing assets running, an old version of Windows that's end of life, end of support. The likelihood is that those assets over time will become more than just a stale old technical debt asset, it could be very detrimental to your business, and it could preclude you from continuing to operate. So those are my thoughts on that. I'll pass it over to Stephen to share some more.
Yeah, thanks, Tomas. And I'm definitely in agreement here. I think if we take a step back, right, I like to make sure that we go to the root and the source, right? And the term technical debt was coined by a developer, Ward Cunningham, right? And when you look at, he was one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto. And what you see in the writings is that this really started with the development community, but I think over time we've just adopted technical debt to, or tech debt to really encompass so much of what we see in technology as a whole. And tech debt is ultimately rooted in trying to get things done quickly at the cost of like something downstream that we're going to have to either fix or work on, right? So really it's about speed over perfect delivery. And to Tomas's point, not all technical debt is bad, and not all technical debt can be avoided. And so I think to build on Tomas's example, right, like in any real financial debt, right, you have to have some form of tech or debt management, right? And I think tech debt is no different. Knowing what you're getting yourself into is a key part of it, because there is, this conscious decision to go into tech debt, but there's also like, debt that people go into that was inadvertent, or they weren't looking for it or thinking about it. And those can have some serious ramifications. And the thing with tech debt, it's not only isolated to one particular group, right? Like it can have a knock-on effect or a domino effect, right? If developers here code something and take on a certain level of tech debt, that can easily go into security, and then security has to deal with some things. So because of this, you have to have a pretty solid management plan for how you're going to deal with tech debt, or it could have some pretty adverse consequences. Look, being in the security field, I think security is one of the poster childs for tech debt, as far as I can remember, because when you really think about even the beginnings of the web, right, it was never intended for e-commerce and secure transactions, right? So it was always, let's get this out to the end user, and security, I don't even think it was an afterthought, back then. Obviously the world has shifted, and obviously we've got things everywhere. Security now has to be something that's baked into the process, right? I've given this example in the past. The average person, if you try to sell them a car and told them, hey, this car was built, but we didn't add the airbags or the seat belts until after it was done, we tacked it on. I think the average person would be less likely to buy that car. But in the tech world and in the business world, we've gone so long with security being that afterthought, and tacking it on afterward, that people have just gotten used to it, where now I think that tech debt for how long security has been pushed down the road is really starting to, rear its head and starting to cost companies just billions of dollars in having to resolve it. But I'll pause there, and then I'll hand it over to Leon to make sure you get to jump in here and add your piece.
Thanks, Steve. A couple other things to keep in mind. Unless you think about it for a long time, people don't think of critical infrastructure. So the things that protect our water, things that protect electricity, are all, quite frankly, as old as I am. And that's no spring chicken. So, there's a lot of stuff there. There's also a number of things that people are just plain scared. I've run into people over the last 20 years that I really don't want to touch what Johnny did, because nobody knows what he did. Mm-hmm. And so that system that's running right now may not be running if I fix it, because, Johnny was a screw up. So, if I try and fix it, I'm going to have to fix a lot more than that one thing. And the third thing that people tend to find, it's amazing how much stuff you don't know that you have. I've been in organizations that if we're moving a data center, we forgot about that thing that we had. It's Tomas, mentioned old versions of Windows and stuff. There are things today that were built to run on Windows 95 that they can't move it. So there's different ways that you can worry about what you have. It's the tech debt you can fix, and there's that tech debt that you have to kind of ring fence off from everything else and just protect it any way you can.
Yeah. And I will add to that, right? Just continuation on that. You don't know what you have is one of the biggest problem, right? That we felt. This is hence Apexa IT got started, because this was my biggest problem at one of the larger organizations that I managed IT at, right? Because I don't know what I had. and I needed to know what I have so that I can actually plan it accordingly, right? So we'll get back to that, and I'll just show you guys a consolidation of what you guys all said. We did a quick study, and funny answers that we needed. How did it get so big? Hey, answer was not my problem, right? It's not my job. I was not in the mood, right? Why add more work onto my plate? This is the next person's worry. Nobody took care of it till now. Why should I? Right. So these are the points that came out is like why this became so big is because of that. And then the key thing, the people who really want to do something, they just don't know where to start, right? And Thomas, your point, right? And what is my critical infrastructure? Even if I know I have some issues, right? Where should I start? Right? Where should I start? Where should I go and get the next business approved from my management, showing that hey, I have this life cycle project that I need to finish, right? But I had that problem where we know we are technical that touched around $1 billion, right? But I needed to replace some hardware, I needed to upgrade some hardware, but I didn't have a concrete business case to put together because I went to the management with spreadsheets, right? So the spreadsheets are like, hey, I need this much money, and their answer is here's 5% of that. But I want you to show me if you spend this 5% that I'm giving it to you today in the next 6 months, what is the return that we're going to get out of that? All right. So that kind of the challenges that we have in the industries, right? In the people problem, right? The people who really want to do something, how can they actually do something about it? So I'm gonna throw out a question out there, right? What are the recommendations that you have for some people, how to handle the technical debt that they have accumulated over the years, which has become, as Stephen, you said, most of a CISO issue, right? Because they are the one who are kind of responsible for this now. And what kind of a recommendation for our fellow CISOs and CIOs that you guys have, and how to treat it that way?
Yeah, so I'll jump in on that one first. I think, Lokesh, one of the things that people have to remember about security is that at the end of the day, security is just risk management, right? And I think that tech debt is, something that needs to be treated as a business risk, right? Because gone unchecked for too long, the business can have significant ramifications for what tech debt is. But I think there's a flip side to that too, is, we have something like, I think the technical term is linkages, right? Someone will do something, and because of poor documentation, and this is an example of like inadvertent tech debt, right? Poor documentation is kept, and then no one understands why something is being done. So it was a good example a few years back of this car manufacturer who was making their car windows be able to sustain winds. I think it was like 100 miles per hour, right? The rear window. And years later, some folks came and said, this car is never going to travel 100 miles per hour going in reverse. So let's save money by like not having the window be, able to resist 100-mile-an-hour winds. Lo and behold, car gets shipped to its destination. Half the cars show up with broken back windows, and no one knows why. Well, what they figured out was that, hey, when we transport these vehicles, some of them are on the train, with their back window facing, these winds that are hitting at 100 plus miles an hour. So there would be an example of like, if you're not keeping the right documentation, you're not going to be able to explain what you're doing. And so when we talk about being able to identify business risk, we have to be able to explain why we're taking on certain steps, right? So in this example, this wouldn't even be tech debt, right? These are things that are required for us to do. But in doing that documentation and doing that review, we're also able to say, well, this doesn't make sense and this doesn't make sense. So when you can get those analytics in front of the people who are going to actually be approving your expenses and, expenditures for either moving the business forward or managing risk, without that level of detail and information, they just think that we're throwing spreadsheets at them. So you got to be very analytical about measuring that tech debt.
I think the thing is that, when we think about technical debt, it's not sexy. to go in and do what I'll call fundamentals to the asset management, IT inventory, right, end of life cycle of your hardware, your technology. And since it's not in that sort of category, it doesn't always get of different folks that work within the organization that want to be attached to things that are sort of generating revenue. What I argue would be fundamental components are what help you get the, fundamental components around understanding assets over their life cycle will help you actually manage risk and manage your balance sheet better, because now you can understand, well, how much is the true return on investment for this asset, whether it's a asset hardware, asset application, or the likes. Are we obtaining the true value of that asset over the life cycle of that asset? And if we get it right, you would always, just before it starts to decline, if you will, in terms of that return on investment, you recycle or move or shift that asset and bring in another one, and you continue to grow in that sort of peak, if you will, right? So you peak your asset, you get the true value out of it before it starts to decline, where you're going to start to lose value. You recycled, you refresh that technology, and then you continue on another peak. So I think those initiatives around lifecycle management of assets will help better manage risk overall. But then as leaders, we need to start to map that back to businesses, to the business objectives, and help that the business incorporates that lifecycle management and true ownership for how to move their business to new application, a new piece of hardware, or new innovation, right? No one's going to be able to do generic AI on a Windows. It's not going to happen. Your servers about the future.
Perfect.
It's interesting. If you, when's the last time as a CISO you've walked through your data center? And my guess is if you walk through there and see something that says compact, you're in a bad way. Okay. But one of the best ways that I found to manage tech debt, this is a company about a dozen years ago, we leased everything in data center. So we had to send it back. So it was planned obsolescence, because that's when the lease was up and nobody wanted to buy out the leases. So that ended up working pretty well. But again, going back to, Tomás talked about the fundamentals. At its core, it may be just walking through with a clipboard and doing an inventory. What do I have? If you have stuff that is, 6, 7, 8 years old, you may need to have some of it. But in general, that stuff's got to go away, because it's way past its prime. It's way past any kind of reasonable life cycle.
Yeah, and the impact is very high, right? And we'll talk about the impact of having an aging infrastructure in the environment, right? And the biggest thing that I see is that if you have an aging hardware, that means that you cannot buy any more warranty or maintenance on it, right? Which means the company has stopped making any security patches for that, or any other patches for that, right? That means that these cannot be upgraded anymore. And there are new vulnerabilities coming every day, right? That means that you have the ticking time machine sitting in your environment with open to the vulnerabilities, with that aging hardware, which is the manufacturer or OEMs have already told you that we are not going to provide you any updates on that one, right? So that's the one impact I see, right? Any other kind of a major impact that you see of having aging infrastructure in your environment? Because the way I see it, right, these are the ticking time machines sitting in your environment. So any thoughts on the impact or having an aging hardware in your infrastructure?
I think the broad thought that I would have is, when you think about maturity of your program, whether you're a CIO or CISO or just a technology leader in general, you have to incorporate software lifecycle management, hardware lifecycle management in your program. If you don't have an idea as to how much aged technology you have, then are you really managing your operating budget effectively? Because your technology will go down and you'll be in the mix of trying to do disaster recovery, business continuity, or the likes, and it's a sort of downstream effect, is what I'm getting at, right? It's a critical component, often overlooked, but if you keep monitoring it on an annual basis and you start to have time trackers, right, that show you and align to the vendor's support for the technology and mapping to that sort of end of life, end of support time scale, then you'll be able to manage your life cycle of your asset. And I'm using asset as hardware, software, able to manage that accordingly, and not do problems downstream where it could detrimentally your business and essentially take it down for a period of time.
So you think that this would be part of their quarterly? What is the recommendation that you have for CISOs and CIOs out there? Like, there was a question from the audience as well, that how often do you review that, and how often do you guys recommend to review your technical debt or aging hardware infrastructure? And what is the recommendation that you guys have? You said it should be a part of your regular cadence, right? So what is the frame, or often do you think that it should be done?
Yeah, for me, for technology that I manage and support, it's usually on an annual, refreshing the strategy. And as we think about putting in new budgetary requests, we're usually looking at that on an annual basis and keeping tabs on those expiration date, if you will. It's kind of like having old milk in your fridge, right? You know it's going to expire within 14 days. You might as well drink it within 12 days. I do the same thing with our hardware and software. We have a date as to when it's going to expire. We know what that time period looks like, and then we try to manage and plan accordingly. And it's usually at an annual checkpoint where we're doing that exercise, if you will.
Perfect. Steven and Leon?
So ideally, in particular with programs, I think, when you're taking percentages, it's about 10% of the time that you're spending on programs is what, so whether you're doing it by sprints or something like, so maybe, once a quarter, if you can, right? But the problem here is that, even if we're looking at hardware, right? Like tech debt, it's not really spread evenly, right? It depends. What are you running on the hardware? Like, what are those assets, right? Because when you really look at tech debt and you look at the history of it, it's usually like a core set of assets that are responsible for the most tech debt, right? So if I've got aging hardware, as a security person, I see that as a risk, because if we can't get the parts, if we can't get the software and availability is impacted, I'm always going to look at that as a risk. But even from a risk management perspective, if there's an asset that we've deemed more critical than another, right, then all of a sudden that hardware is not the same to us anymore. So I think it's a matter of prioritizing, what's important to us. What are we saying is really relevant to the business? And that might actually need to have 20% of time being spent on, hey, we need to really be on top of this to see where are we comfortable with this level of tech debt, or, if this thing's end of life, how long are we comfortable with that, right? Like, where is the business risk? So, but yeah, I'd say in the 10 to 20% range would be really the ideal time spent on tech debt.
Can I ask a follow-up question before Leon starts? Right, you brought up a really good point, Steven, is to associate that with the business application and prioritize accordingly, right? To see if we can live with that, right? How critical it is, for the business application, and how kind of visible it is to the internet, or what's the risk factor of that if I keep this device running for a longer time, right? So I can get the best out of it while my business applications are not getting affected and my risk is not getting affected, right? So associating with the business application, I think, is one of the big thing where in this economy, right, where people are trying to save a lot of money, right? Running an hardware which is end of life, but the operating system that running on that hardware, we still have patches available, may get an extended warranty on that hardware to run it a little longer if there is no business risk, or if there isn't a business application risk on it. So is that where you're going with it, or
yeah, it's part of your overall asset criticality, right? Like if you have a program to define what are your critical assets, there's going to be scoring behind that, right? Some of this is going to be scored higher than others, right? So whether you have business impact analysis or BIA reports, you should have something to tell you what's more relevant and more important to the business than others, so that you can focus. Because security, technically, everything here is finite resources, right? So security is going to have a finite resources to deal with these things, and we have to know where to put them accordingly, right? So anything that is higher risk, we want to address much more quickly and with much more care.
Perfect.
You know,
Sorry.
no,
Go ahead.
there's a couple things that, you know, for one, I tend to look at things in how much I get to sleep, which is not much, you know, and the problem is that technical debt translates into attack surface, you know, so the more you can get rid of your technical debt, the better I sleep. And I'm sure it's the same with, you know, with almost all CISOs. There's enough happening on a daily basis. I mean, I'm sure there's another Chrome 0 day come out today, if not today, tomorrow. And how do you plan for some of those things on some of the older versions of, you know, if people are still running Windows 2008 server, I mean, there's been no patches for a long time, and you're taking that risk as you go. You know, now in the hardware standpoint, you know, we are almost exclusively VMs. So, you know, I'm not as worried about, you know, do I have that old iteration of hardware? I'm more worried about that old iteration of software, or those Java libraries, or those things that are more difficult to manage and maintain, because people are worried that, well, I don't want to fix that because, you know, Johnny did that 10 years ago, and if I touch it, it'll break. You know, it's getting over that hurdle of, you know, I've got to fix it, because if not, I don't get to sleep.
So do you guys think, right, it's the board who needs to step in and take that risk, right? I'll tell you one thing, right? When I was managing IT, was managing the lifecycle program, right? Replacing a server was much easier, right? There's a server in the data center, right? We can find out how many applications are running, what the application users are. You know, doing it from the server side, it's easier, but the server access switches were one of our biggest problem, right? Server is a problem, but server access, where we have multiple servers attached, right? That was the biggest problem. So if somebody is not taking or is not signing on the risk, right? Who do you think should be saying, like, is it a CISO's job? Is it a CIO's job? Is it a CEO's job? Who should be taking that risk and say, yep, go ahead and lifecycle that switch, or lifecycle patch that server, or replace that server? Who do you think that where does that risk resides in case something goes wrong while people are actually fixing the problem or lifecycling the hardware?
I mean, that one's clear cut, right? You know, these are business decisions, right? In the CISO world, our job is more enforcement than anything, right? Like, we generally are here to just identify risk, right? Like, hey, business, you want to do this, and it's really cool and it's really great. Here are the risks that we see. You now, as the business, have to accept this risk, reject this risk, transfer it with cybersecurity insurance, et cetera. And I think that's where the role of the CISO and folks that do what we do is. Now, that business sponsor in this case can designate to someone else, right? Whether it be the head of IT, whether it be someone, but ultimately the business is somehow signing off on that risk. And this stuff has to be documented, right? Because everyone's going to get audited at some point or another, right? Whatever your organization is, you shouldn't really just be doing it for audit. You should be doing it just because it's good compliance and good practices. But it is not the role of, like, CISOs, for example, to just accept that risk unless we've been told you're now the designee for this.
Perfect. So Leon, I'm going to throw that question back to you, right? You are both CIO and CISO, right? So you are actually the problem who is setting up that there is a risk, and you're also responsible for fixing or working with the business and fixing the problem of that risk. So how do you handle this in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, I listen to which voice is screaming inside my head more. No, to be seriously, I take care for the two things I don't own on the CIO side are development and core data center compute. I own everything else. So one of the things that I do on a monthly basis is I give my dev leaders, and I've got 14 lines of business. So I give my dev leaders access to all the same tools that I have. So if they want to see their cloud posture, they can see it before I do. Unfortunately, I see it before they do because they're not looking at it. But I will give them, here's the top 20 worst every month. So it is well known who is the worst. And in fact, about 5-6 years ago, we had a company that we spun off, and we told them we were using BitSight at the time. We said, you are by far the suckiest one out of all of our companies. And 6 months later, they were the best because they didn't want to be told in front of everybody else, in front of their peers, that they sucked. So there are some cases where you can use that carrot. Some cases where we use the stick and say, hey, these guys are always consistently good. They may not be perfect, but they're good. And so I think there's a way of kind of, Stephen talked about transferring risk, but it's more sharing the risk. One of the things that I told our chief technology officer several years ago is, if I go down, you go with me because you see the same stuff I do. And so kind of sharing the burden with others ends up making it something that we're both fighting for. Does it work all the time? No, but it shares that burden appropriately.
Tomás?
Yeah, look, the perspective I have with this is all around risk management and transparency. And our job, at least the way I see my job, is to translate to my business stakeholders how much risk are they taking at any given point in time of the day, if you will, and how fast can they run and operate and essentially be, drive towards their business objectives. So unless this bubbles up to like an enterprise level risk to the organization, chances are this will be a conversation between the CISO, CIO, and whichever business may be impacted by way of the technology that's either end of life or end of support, or for whatever reason doesn't want to be recycled. And usually at that point is really just trying to have a conversation with the stakeholders to help them understand the rationale, right? Understand their perspective, try to hear and listen to their perspective as to why, for whatever reason, you can't sort of recycle the technology. And then once you've understood their business perspective, then you overlay the challenges and the opportunities, right? And try to work through that so that you don't have to get into a conversation around, well, I'm just going to accept that risk. Because a lot of times stakeholders, if they're trying to reach their agenda, they're more than not likely going to just accept the risk because they don't fully appreciate and understand that risk. But once you've had an opportunity to have a conversation, rational people will make rational decisions. And more times than not, business stakeholders don't want to accept risks that they don't necessarily have to. So I think it's having that level of understanding and relationship with your business counterpart, obviously with your IT counterpart, who essentially owns and is accountable for managing assets and the likes in the environment, and then going in as a joint collaborative effort as leaders for the organization to say, look, this is how we're helping you meet your business objectives. These are the things that we need to be able to do to meet your business objectives. And one of those entails making sure that we change the oil in our car every so often, unless you have an electric vehicle where it doesn't have oil in an engine like that. Yep. But you get my point.
I heard you loud and clear, both of you and three of you, right? Like showing the risk associated with the business unit and going with something concrete, and then giving them the real and guide them right into that perspective and say, okay, this is the risk. We can do these three things. Either we can do hardware replacement, a code upgrade, or Leon, you mentioned before, I think Tomás, you mentioned ring fence, right? If that needs to be there, let's just ring fence the environment for a time being until we need to keep this environment up and running. So I'll give you a simple example, right? We had a call recording platform in one of my organization, and we moved to a new call recording platform. But as a part of the Fed requirement, we have to keep all the recordings for 7 years, right? And those infrastructure was running on Windows 2000. But since we need to keep the old recordings for so many years, and we couldn't migrate those recordings to the new platform, We had to leave that environment up and running. Business accepted the risk, technology accepted the risk, but we ring fenced that application saying only few of these people can access this environment and only certain ports when needed. But it was completely ring fenced to make sure everything is behind, and that's how we accepted the risk from that perspective. But having that visibility, having that assets associated with the application, and showing them a separate risk for that particular business unit or business application was the key thing for us to do from that perspective. So, so I heard you guys um, pretty well, right? That this is something that we need to do to either ring fence or to work with them as a collaborate effort, and showing them that there's something that we can do. Leon, you mentioned attack surface a few minutes ago, right? So can you elaborate what are you guys seeing in today's world? Because that has become what Gartner is calling a chasm, cyber asset attack surface management, right? What is your thought on that? And we can start with Leon, you, and uh,
Sure.
yeah.
I want to start, and then I want to go back to something that you said that previously. So the first thing, I can see all of my cloud assets. I see exactly what the attack surface looks like, what the attack paths are, and I can share that with my development teams at any given time. They can look at any of their assets and see what those attack paths are. How would you get there? We also use some automated pen testing tools to show them on a more frequent basis. Here's how we would go after stuff. So knowing what the attack surface looks like, knowing what our where else am I at risk in a, for most people, probably in a non-zero trust world yet. Where can people get lateral movement to go to? But I wanted to go back to one thing you said, and it was who owns stuff. And I wanted to remind people before I forgot about it, the SEC just came out with new guidelines. And while they didn't hit the board with disclosing their skills, I think that if you haven't read it, and I haven't read it all, it's about 180 pages, but that's a worthwhile read for you to have in your back pocket for if you are a publicly traded company. It's going to be in your benefit to be able to use those things and be able to show people where the company risk is, not just the target that's painted on our back.
That's good. We have a question. Anything, Tomas or Steven, you guys want to add? We have a question from the audience. I can read it.
We have a few questions from the audience. So let me see if I can hit some of these, because I think some of these, at least for me, are connected, right? We have a question from our sense here. Most of the companies that the CSO is not part of the lifecycle management or patch management process, especially Fortune 500 companies. The infrastructure managers manage this type of initiative. What is your recommendation on how CSOs get involved in this type of initiative? I think the job of the security team is to always be this independent third party, right? So even if some other team is responsible for patch management and things like that, security still has to provide that independent lens. So, and this is no, disparagement on the IT team, but if you come to me and tell me, hey, we patched, I'm just not going to take your word for it, right? Either I'm using your platform or some independent way of using your platform or another platform to confirm those results, right? So say you're using like an Apexa or something to say, hey, did you actually confirm that those patches were there, right? And now we start getting into the space of like CSPM, right? Cloud Security Platform Management, right? Like, what does this environment look like? What are we saying should be the current version of it? Is there deviation from it, right? So I think those are platforms and tools that we just make sure we use to make sure that we're part of the conversation. Now, I personally don't want to be the one signing off on what patches are done and all, right? Like that should be an automated process, right? Because what I don't want is security to really be slowing down the business. For me, my stance has always been that security has to move at the speed of business. And so ideally you want to be part of a workflow process, but not really blocking it, right? Because I see in the next question we have, for virtual machines or containers, how do you identify technical debt around software and operating systems being outdated? I think we're in the same vein there, right? So in one sense, we have CSPM tools with containers and virtualization. These are more ephemeral in nature. So, containers can be created and destroyed like at a moment's notice. So traditional security tools from the previous era don't necessarily operate in this space. So I think this is when you're going to be looking at container security platform type tools to help you see what's in there. And so in my experience, some of the better things to do there is very similar to CSPM, to set this baseline of this is what we think a good container looks like. And depends on how deep you want to enforce it. Like, you can actually use some container security platforms to say, do not allow this container to launch if it has a higher critical vulnerability, as an example. Or you can let it be a little bit more passive and let people load it, but then kind of jump on top of it. So those are two things I want to make sure that we answer for the audience. Anybody else, please jump in.
The only thing I would sort of add to this conversation is the concept, and you can put this into practice, of continuous control monitoring, right? So if the CISO's organization is not accountable or responsible for the assets and the lifecycle, based on the sort of prior question, one of the prior questions, you want to pull out metrics that show you that the control is still in place, the control is still effective over time. And that control is patch management, that control is lifecycle management of assets, of hardware, software, right? Have a mechanism to be able to pull out over the lifecycle of when you have that in place, and look for those controls to essentially be still applied and still applicable, and pull out the metrics and do that governance and oversight function, and then essentially working collaboratively with the accountable parties, and help them understand when things go astray, or ensure that they have the same level of transparency to be able to identify when things go astray. So meaning that they haven't sort of executed on what their desired outcome, they haven't executed on what they initially implemented, and it's for whatever reason is no longer effective control in place anymore. And then you go back and you sort of iterate on that. So that would be the only piece that I would add to that, is that sort of proactive nature of being of ensuring that you have some level of continuous control monitoring in place, and have that report out.
Hey, Lokesh, going back to the question Asensio asked,
Yep.
My guess is, his question was, well, how do you get involved with lifecycle and patch management? My question is the corollary to that. Who's involved when there's a breach? It's going to be you. And so you have a right to know what's getting done, so you don't walk into stuff blind. So I would approach it from the opposite, not how do I get involved, but I have the right, because I'm going to be the guy that is answering questions for legal, that is answering questions for how did this happen? And it's not just, well, they wouldn't let me. It's he has the right to see that stuff.
Yeah.
I'll step off my soapbox now. So
I would say we actually had a use case webinar done a couple of weeks ago with one of the very a company who manages multiple banks, and we brought CISO and CIO, right? And the topic was good things happen when security and technology work together, right? So it's good to have controls, good to have matrixing, and good to have these things in having a complete visibility from CISO's perspective, to make sure what our attack surface is, make sure what the lifecycle management is, the patch management is, right? And what are the gaps? Where are the vulnerabilities that we have, and how those vulnerabilities are? What are the controls over vulnerabilities, like high risk 1 week? Are they actually being done? And who's actually doing it? Is the technology people who are doing it, right? So both sides working together, where we have controls, we're providing you, these are the gaps, and hey, are we fixing it and keeping an eye on it from the metrics perspective, is the best way to keep a company secure. And that brings me to Leon. You said the magic word a few minutes ago, was to give you a good night of sleep, right? Whether it's a security person, whether it's a technology person, whether it's a finance person, whether it's a business, right? You need to have a combination of 4 business units working together to get a good night of sleep, is kind of where I come in. I would say I would recommend people to actually go back and watched that webinar where it's like the good things happen when technology and security people work together. And I thought that was a good use case where um, having not just the visibility, having just not knowing the attack surface or software or system build of material, but having not just the controls but an automated processes to fix it is the key to get to a secure environment from that perspective, and get a good, better night of sleep from that perspective. And any last thoughts that you guys have? I know we are coming at the end of the way, but any last thoughts that you guys have? Leon, we'll start with you. And um, actually, there is another question that we have. So before we go there, who wants to take that?
I can take that. I mean, the two that I'm aware of are Horizons and Pantera, and they're worth a look. Are they perfect? No, but they're pretty good. And when you're looking at doing something that is not just once a year point in time, but having the ability to say, I feel like running a pen test tonight, and being able to do that. Now in concert with your app dev teams and stuff, but they do a good job.
Yeah, I'll throw in there that in the past I've used things like GuidePoint, like Burp Suite, Tenable, Qualys, but I want to make sure that there's a disclaimer here, right? And I'm not endorsing tools, I'm just saying what I've used. But I think also something to note is that because a lot of us that are in cloud are on, using things like AWS or Azure and things like that, I would recommend you guys read your agreements, because you can't go willy-nilly just pen testing stuff without someone in AWS knocking on your door or something like that and say, hey, what's going on? So please work with your cloud service provider, before you do any of this stuff, because it will save you some headaches downstream, right? Don't want anybody to find out the hard way.
I guess, Lokesh, one thing you brought up, and I think it's critical, is the relationship between security and IT. And I've had for the last probably 15 years pretty good relationship. I mean, now it's just the voices in my head that are arguing. But when I'm working with our chief digital officer, our CTO in the past, it's I have his back, he has mine, and we've been in board meetings where he would come to my defense on some things, I would come to his defense. So I take that as my responsibility to make sure that relationship is good. But I think from the security side, doing everything you can to make sure that, at the end of the day, we are not trying to be Dr. No, you can't go do that. But it's, most of us have been around for a long, long time, and we can help you do things a little bit better. And so it's being there to offer a helping hand or, occasional words of wisdom, as opposed to, no, just don't do it that way. That's wrong.
Michelle, do we have another question? You said we have a follow-up question.
Yeah, we have another question from Matthew Fish again. I'll read it out for the team. Risk is sometimes a very much based on asset and business goals, and they're difficult to keep fresh. With the new SEC rule, you need to be able to show risk analysis, and especially if there is an incident. Are you using cyber risk quantitative automated technology? That's the question.
Or you guys are going to use it now. That's where Apexa comes in. So whoever wants to take it, please.
Well, I was just going to say that I don't think the spirit of the SEC rule means that you need to use cyber risk quantitative automated analysis and the likes. I think the spirit of the SEC rules is that you have a risk assessment and risk governance process in place, and that you're able to execute that effectively, and that you're able to ensure that that's effective over time, right? That you're essentially continually trying to identify issues in your environment, and you're working through by way of a governance structure within your organization to manage and manage the risks that are presented to you in your business. If you're not doing those, what I'll call fundamental things, then yeah, the SEC will essentially take issue with that and with you as a company. A lot of what has come down the pipe. It's not necessarily new doctrine. It's just instilling and validating and ensuring that this is all top of mind, and now not only top of mind for the companies, but instilling that this is part of those filings and providing the right levels of transparency around how you're managing risk for your organization, how you're securing data that you're obtaining, and how you're handling just broad-based cyber threats to your environment, right? So I think all of those things are really positive, but again, none of them say you need to go down the path of the sort of quantitative automated aspect of it. However, if you are a more mature organization, which a lot of financial services companies where I worked at in my past are mature, then chances are you're using all of those techniques and frameworks in place to be able to manage risk for your organization appropriately.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, right? I've always been very deliberate when I use the term people, process, technology, and I use it in that order, right? To be successful, you need the right people, and then you need the right processes. And finally, the technology is there just to kind of smooth all that through, right? And so, so Matthew, in your question, like any technology you use should just really be kind of a means for an end, right? You have the right people, you have all the right processes, and if you've got the right technology to kind of help speed that up and make it more efficient, then more power to you, right? Ultimately, I think your question is, is there a place where we can get something so that risk can be quantifiable in maybe dollar terms, for example, or euros, right? Which is ideal, right? As a board member, I'd like to see something that tells me, hey, that risk right there is going to cost me between the range of this dollars and this dollars, right? That will attract my attention a lot more than a spreadsheet that isn't really telling me much, right? Or it's telling me too much. So I think that's key. Now, what the SEC was trying to do, I still, on my end, think that we've seen over time that cybersecurity continues to be something that's pretty serious and operating in today's modern compute environment. So I think it would behoove boards to make sure that they've got some cybersecurity expertise in that board, so that people get a better sense of what risk management decisions they're making. If you got CISOs on your board, great. If you've got people who are training in security, great. You just want people there to be able to understand that risk. So that's my 2 cents on this.
Yeah, and if I can just throw one thing in there, going back to what Thomas said, and it's very spot on. It's understanding what you have, where you have it. I've seen way too many people that have bought tools that just sit on the shelf. So it doesn't matter if you got the tool, but you don't have the underlying process to take care of it. Again, making sure you know what you got, where it is, what it's doing. Those are going to be the more important things they're looking at than, did you go out and buy the newest shiny?
And I don't have to add definition of Apexa IQ to that. But before we go, I want you guys to, one last thing, right? You guys had been a good part of Apexa IQ's journey. So thank you very much for being on the advisor board, providing your expertise day in, day out to make sure that we are always working towards the right goal. Here at Apexa's, last questions, Leon, start with you. Why Apexa? Why did you choose Apexa as multiple things? You give your time to Apexa. Why Apexa?
Well, I think it goes back to what I just said, knowing what I have, where it is, and what it does. If you don't have those things to start with, you can't. You're working off spreadsheet, and that's not going to get you anywhere.
Thank you very much, Leon. Steven.
Yeah, for me, it's about we talked in the past about security being able to manage things, right? But if you can't see it and you don't have solid inventory, it's going to be really hard to pull that off. So the view and the visibility into what's there, not just a particular kind of asset, but generally all assets, right? Being able to raise issues like compliance, being able to raise issues like obsolescence. These are things that now, with the combination of us being able to define assets and their criticality, help us zero in our resources where we need the most. So that's just something that I think anybody should be all over.
Yeah, and what I'll say, Lokesh, and I just wanted to chime in on the prior question as well, just very quickly, was I think some companies are going to struggle with defining what material is in terms of the SEC filing. So why Apexa? And this is my tie into Apexa. I think the mission is spot on as to what we're trying to achieve. I think the ability of helping not only IT leaders, but CISOs sort of sleep easier with the tooling and the instrumentation to be able to identify those assets and be able to manage their life cycle over a period of time is going to be very key and critical. And then ultimately helping those technology leaders understand the material impact the material impact by way of understanding the assets and the inventory that they have, and that sort of in that vein of, if there is an incident, you can start to deduce, well, this incident impacted these several pieces of assets. This is the bulk of how much business impact that is in terms of dollars and cents, which will help ultimately publicly traded companies be able to meet the SEC regulations around being able to report an incident that is material to your business.
So thank you very much, all three of you and the entire team behind the scene, who's made this possible. I hope everybody enjoyed it. So thank you very, very, very much, and have a great day. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye now.